All right, so good morning, everyone. So today we're going to now switch to a new topic within the realm of topics of metals in medicine. And here we're going to focus on those metals that have demonstrated an anti-diabetic property. And we've alluded to this in the beginning of the course when we talked a little bit about the speciation of vanadium-4 and also vanadium-5 in an aqueous environment. So now we're going to look at more closely at relevant vanadium-4 and vanadium-5 compounds that do demonstrate this anti-diabetic property and what is the source of it. But to do so, we need to first discuss the context of glucose homeostasis. So this concept of homeostasis we introduced at the very beginning of this course, where we focus on the idea of how do you regulate a molecule or an element, as we discussed at the very beginning, biomolecularly. And so here, what's presenting is a visual about the regulation of blood glucose to obtain an optimal level in the human body. So here, optimal is something about, let's say, 5 millimolar in human blood. And so here are the pathways that can contribute to this regulation. You have the source of glucose that enters through externally through diet, but you also have the source that comes through glycogenolysis, which is essentially the breakdown of the polymer glucose, glycogen, into its monomers, or the formation within the body of glucose, so via gluconeogenesis. But then you have the subsequent use of this molecule, whether it's in the form of glycolysis, glycogenesis, or lipogenesis. And so this is essentially the idea of utilizing the glucose, storing it, or bioconverting it for use. So here's another perspective of this idea of maintaining a glucose homeostasis and looking at food as the source of an external entry of glucose, and essentially how we can regulate the amount of glucose within the body. So this perspective of eating something such as in this example here, ice cream, that will give you an influx of sugar into your blood. So you have this increasing amount of sugar, and the way your body responds is by your pancreatic beta cells sensing that there is an influx of sugar. So that's going to be greater than the basal or the normal level of sugar that's available. And so what happens then is that your beta cells will express a hormone known as insulin, which is, depending on your perspective, it's a hormone peptide or hormone protein. So then that release insulin, what it does, it will send a signal that essentially there is this influx of glucose. And so you have your adipose cells, so your fat cell, that will take up this glucose. And then that leads to then the utilization of it. But you also have contributions of, in this case, exercise that can lead to the consumption of glucose as it is a source of energy. So what occurs is a decrease of the amount of sugar that's in the body. And so a consequence of this decrease, let's say a little bit below the homeostatic or optimal level, is that your body responds by its pancreatic alpha cells expressing another hormone. This hormone is glucagon. And so then glucagon basically signals that there is a decrease in the optimal amount of glucose in the body. So what it does, it basically activates the liver to break down glycogen. Glycogen, again, is a polymer of glucose. So you break it down proteolytically to then get glucose, and then you can restore that homeostatic amount. So this is essentially the perspective of how you can control the amount of sugar in the body. As part of this cycle of homeostasis is the role of glucose transporters. So these are proteins that are responsible for the influx of glucose within cells. And there are actually a number of transporters. Here we just have a list of 5. And I list these particular ones just to give us a perspective of their tissue distribution and where they play a function. As an example, we have glucose transporter 1, which is located in most cells, and its function is basically to help in terms of the uptake of the basal amount of glucose. Then you have the glucose transporter 2, which is located within certain cells. And so here's just a listing of these where they're located. Function is to carry glucose and fructose in liver and intestine. And so you see that depending on localization, you may have a different transporter that plays a particular function with respect to either basal glucose or glucose that's brought in through diet. So I mentioned insulin as an important hormone. So again, depending on your perspective, how we're going to focus on this, it is a peptide when you look at it from its basic components. So the human insulin consists of 51 amino acids. So that's approximately 5,800 Dalton. And so in terms of its composition, you can either look at it from this perspective here, or here in this depiction here, where it consists of two chains. So there are these monomeric subunits that interact with one another, forming a dimeric unit consisting of the A chain and the beta chain. And what links these two chains together is the formation of disulfide bonds. And here's just some representation of these disulfide bonds that exist between the two chains. All right. As it turns out, in your body, you can preserve this particular peptide in the form of a hexamer. So what we have depicted to the left is a hexameric form of glucose, where essentially you have 3 units of this dimeric interaction between the A chain and the B chain. So this is basically, this particular structure is stabilized by the presence of 2 zincs that allows for the long-term storage stability of the insulin, but is not the actual active form of the hormone. So what are some of the functions of insulin? So it controls the cellular uptake of glucose in muscle and adipose tissue. It participates in the increase of DNA replication and protein synthesis via control of amino acid uptake, and also stimulates glycogen formation in liver. Again, that's a storage of glucose. So here we have a zoomed in perspective of the hexameric form of the protein. And so what we're looking at again is the 3 different units, these dimeric units, and how they are stabilized by the presence of 2 zincs. So if we zoom in into this region, each of these zincs is coordinated by the presence of 3 histidines, and those histidines, where they're originating from, well, they're originated from the beta chain right here. And so that provides a source of stabilization of the actual insulin. And then you have the further stabilization of hydrogen bonds within the dimeric units. All right, so let's talk a bit about the function of insulin more closely. So what you have is a secretion of insulin as a response to an influx of glucose. So the pancreas has hundreds of thousands of cell clusters called islets of Langerhans, where the beta cells live. So here's just a depiction of where you localize these islets and this expression of beta cells, which are responsible for the release of the insulin hormone. So the beta cells release insulin in response to increased blood glucose in a time frame of about 10 minutes. As it turns out, any alteration in the function of these cells actually has a very profound impact on glucose homeostasis. So if you have an excessive excretion of insulin, what that can lead to is hypoglycemia. Or if you have an insufficient secretion, that leads to a disease referred to as type 1 diabetes. So we're going to have a little bit of disclaimer of what exactly is defined as type 1 diabetes in a moment. All right, so here gives a better perspective of this idea of how insulin can participate in signaling, as it is sending a signal due to an influx of glucose and this need to metabolize that glucose so that you don't have an elevated amount of glucose present in the body, which can lead to toxicity. So what we hear depicted in this illustration is that we have insulin, which is recognized by the insulin receptor. So that interaction is key, beginning step in the signaling process. Well, what that leads to then is a tyrosine phosphorylation cascade. So essentially, this insulin receptor is converted into an active enzyme as a consequence of its interaction with insulin. So that interaction with the insulin receptor is critical for this whole process to be triggered. So essentially, that insulin receptor is a tyrosine kinase. In other words, it participates in the phosphorylation of tyrosine, and it triggers this phosphorylation throughout different proteins within the cell. So what we're essentially looking at here in a cartoon representation, you're looking at those, let's call those blue spheres as a representation of phosphorylation of the tyrosine unit, is that basically occurs throughout the whole network. So you get this cascade of phosphorylation occurring. So this phosphorylation serves as the molecular signal to tell the inside of the cell that there is an influx of glucose within blood. And so that's sending a signal to where? Well, sending that signal to a transporter, in this context, the glucose transporter 4. So that signals basically that we have now this glucose that needs to be metabolized. So this leads to the translocation of that glucose transporter 4 to the plasma membrane. So that's essentially what's depicted here. So now you have the translocation of the glucose transporter 4, which is within the cell present as the vesicle. It now becomes part of the plasma membrane, and now it can lead to the influx of glucose within the cellular environment, and then leads to the metabolism of it. Right. But when you offset this control, this response towards glucose, it can lead to the disease known as diabetes mellitus. So abbreviated as DM. DM is a chronic disease that occurs when the pancreas does not produce enough insulin, or when the body cannot effectively use the insulin it produces, right? So this is considered as part of the disease, but two different versions of it. This leads to an overproduction of glucose in the liver and under the utilization of glucose by other organs. Diabetes is characterized by a persistent elevation in blood glucose levels. So remember, a homeostatic control of this molecule is about 5 millimolar in blood. So if you're significantly above that, that is a state of hyperglycemia. And this is a persistent elevation even after fasting. Fasting refers to the act of not having ingested food for an extended period of time. Uncontrolled hyperglycemia leads to serious multisystemic damage, especially in the nerves and blood vessels. So classically, the type 1 diabetes is referred to as a condition in which you have a deficiency to no insulin production, and it requires a daily administration of insulin in order to be able to metabolize glucose that enters through the diet. So this type of disease is considered not preventable. And some of the classical symptoms of the disease are an excessive excretion of urine, thirst, constant hunger, weight loss, vision changes of fatigue, and these may occur suddenly. You have the other classical depiction of the diabetes, which is a type 2, which is basically that the body is able to produce insulin, but it's unable to effectively use it. So there's a resistance to the insulin that's produced. And it is largely the result of excessive body weight and physical activity. So the symptoms are similar to type 1, but are generally less marked than compared to those seen in type 1. And the onset of the actual diagnosis of the disease can be years since the time of it actually arising in the body, just because of the symptoms not being as pronounced as they are in type 1. But a study that was done in 2018 tried to look more closely at diabetes. And here essentially was a study of different patients that had diabetes and cluster them into groups in terms of, of their conditions. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about these clusters and how they, to some extent, can be aligned with the traditional classification of type 1 and type 2. So cluster 1 is that patients that demonstrated severe autoimmune diabetes is broadly the same as the classical type 1. It hit people when they were young and seemingly healthy, and an immune disease left them unable to produce insulin. So there's some indicators that some people that, as a consequence of the COVID-19 disease, had an onset of diabetes, which there may be some link to an autoimmune disease that led to this particular condition. Cluster 2 is a case where there's severe insulin deficient diabetes patients, which initially looked very similar to cluster 1. So these patients were young, had a healthy weight, and they struggled to make insulin, but the source of their diabetes was not the immune system. So theirs is not considered the consequence of an autoimmune disease. Still, cluster 1 falls in line with what would traditionally be seen as more in line with classical type 1. Then we have cluster 3. So these are severe insulin resistant diabetes patients that were generally overweight, capable of making insulin, but their body no longer responding to it. So now here we have a cluster that aligns more with what we consider as type 2, or more classically as type 2. They have cluster 4, which is mild obesity-related diabetes, was seen mainly in people who were very overweight, but metabolically much closer to normal than those in cluster 3. And finally, we have cluster 5, which is mild age-related diabetes patients developed symptoms when they were significantly older than in other groups, and their disease tended to be milder. So here, cluster 1 and 2 fall in line more with classical type 1, the distinction being the source of it, whether it's from an autoimmune condition or not. And 3, 4, and 5 having to do with weight or age, and more aligned with the type 2 diabetes. All right, so look at the common consequences of diabetes. So over time, diabetes can damage the heart, blood vessels, eyes, kidneys, and nerves. So adults with diabetes have a 2 to 3-fold increased risk of heart attacks and strokes, combined with reduced blood flow and neuropathy, which is nerve damage in the feet, increases the chance of foot ulcers, infection, and the eventual need for limb amputation. Diabetic retinopathy is an important cause of blindness and occurs as a result of long-term accumulated damage to the small blood vessels in the retina. 2.6% of global blindness can be attributed to diabetes. Diabetes is among the leading causes of kidney failure. So here I'm going to give you a perspective from the World Health Organization with regards to diabetes. So this is a global perspective. It actually is a little bit older information, but it's still something that is heavily cited because of how dramatic the statistic is. All right, so it turns out that the number of people with diabetes rose from 108 million, this was in 1980, to 422 million by 2014. So that was a really big spike. And the global prevalence of diabetes, so this is a population percentage among adults over 18 years of age, has risen from 4.7% to 8.5%. So again, an older statistic, but one that's still heavily cited just because of how stark the increase in number of people with diabetes. So that gives you a perspective right there of about 1 person in 11 having a condition, diabetes condition. So here, maybe a little hard to see, is looking at the global report on diabetes. So here we're looking at up to 2019. So according to this, we can see that diabetes here is listed as number 9, leading cause of global death. And the white marker and the blue marker here is just basically showing you this growth in time. So you have the growth from 2000 to 2019. In 2019, diabetes mellitus led to between 1.5 to 2 million deaths in that year. Also in that year, 2019, you had another 460,000 kidney deaths that were caused by diabetes. So the primary was kidney, but the people had diabetes. And you also had raised blood glucose, which caused around 20% of the cardiovascular deaths. So looking at this in Puerto Rico, so it's a little hard to get some more recent statistics. This is 2017, also reported by the World Health Organization, where we're looking at different types of diseases, the non-communicable diseases, communicable diseases, and injuries over here. And so what we can see here is that amongst all of the causes, diabetes is actually the 3rd leading cause of death in Puerto Rico. And I actually think that number has gone up since then, but I was not able to get a very good statistic there. All right, so let's look at the source of insulin resistance. So here, the rest of the lecture, we're really going to focus more on type 2 diabetes. Again, that is a phenomenon as a consequence of the body becoming resistant towards the insulin that it is capable of producing. And so it's proposed that a major source of this resistance is the enzyme protein tyrosine phosphatase 1B. So there are many protein tyrosine phosphatases within the body, within cells. And so their function is essentially to cleave phosphate groups from tyrosine. So if you can think back to what I just said a few slides ago, that the phosphorylation cascade is the signaling as a consequence of the insulin interacting with its receptor. Well, what this enzyme does, it basically does the opposite by basically cleaving the phosphate, and so it would interfere with the signaling process. And so we're going to look at this this catalytic process of the cycle here, the inhibition process more closely in a moment. But I just wanted to give you this perspective that we're looking at the substrate, which in this case, the substrate is a phosphotyrosine, and essentially the active site cysteine from the protein, so this is a cysteine here, is going to substitute for the phosphate group on the tyrosine, basically serving as a point of cleavage for that phosphate group. Okay, so we're going to look at that. All right, so paying attention to that cycle, what we have here, actually minimize this. Okay, Well, we have this enzyme, which we're going to abbreviate as PTB1B, which shuts down the insulin signaling by acting at the insulin receptor. So remember that insulin and insulin receptor interaction is critical in terms of that sensitivity towards insulin. And so that triggers the insulin receptor to become an active kinase to then set off this phosphorylation cascade. Well, if this enzyme acts at the insulin receptor and basically cleaves that phosphate group, it's basically going to serve as something that would inactivate the insulin receptor. So it would essentially serve as an inhibition of this phosphorylation cascade. So the expression activity of PTB1B is elevated during type 2 diabetes. So in terms of its mechanism, so let's draw our attention back over here. So we have our substrate, we have our cysteine group. Essentially, what the cysteine is doing, okay, that's at the active side of PTB1B, it's partaking in a nucleophilic attack at the phosphor center. And so what that does, then it essentially cleaves that phosphate group. All right, so then what you have is now your tyrosine regenerated, no longer has the phosphor group, but then you have this cysteine phosphor unit that's present here. Okay, so at this point, the active site of the enzyme is no longer active because it already has that phosphor group. But what happens is that it regenerates the active site cysteine group via a process of a protonation that's facilitated by the glutamate residue there. So that protonates the phosphor group, releasing that phosphor group. And what essentially then does, now we have is an activated cysteine, which can now again participate in this process of inhibiting the this phosphorylation cascade. So it's believed to some perspective that the treatment of type 2 can be the design of inhibitors of PTB1B. So here's where vanadium takes place, where it becomes quite interesting. So a French physician, Dr. Lionnet, first reported the use of vanadium in the form of vanadium salts. So we have vanadate, which was found to treat diabetes in 1899. Okay? And then in the 1980s, the anti-diabetic effect of different vanadium salts was observed in cells in diabetic animals. So here is a perspective of those vanadium salts that were tested. So we have the metavanadate and the vanadium 5. And then we also have the vanadyl sulfate, vanadium 4. All these salts demonstrated an anti-type 2 diabetes property. So just again, given our perspective of focus on transition metals, distinguishing feature between vanadium 4 and vanadium 5, vanadium 4 is paramagnetic, it's D1 electron configuration, whereas vanadium 5 is D0. So that activates different types of spectroscopies or techniques that one can use to characterize these particular compounds. Vanadium 4 being EPR active, vanadium 5 not EPR active, but importantly, vanadium 5 or vanadium 51 is an NMR active nuclei that one can exploit in order to do vanadium NMR. Okay, so what are some of the features observed for these vanadium salts? Well, it was observed that if you place these salts in drinking water, it resulted in normoglycemia. So what does that mean? Basically, it helped to reduce the level of glucose in diabetic rat models. And so at the time, okay, so we're talking about here, this is early on in the study of vanadium. At the time, vanadium was referred to as a mimic of insulin because it did mimic or appeared to mimic the physiological effects of insulin. And so what were those effects? They were the stimulation of glucose uptake in fat cells, the enhancement of glucogenesis in muscles and liver, and stimulation of fatty acids formation in fat cells, and also reduction of cardiac decline in streptozotocin or STZ diabetic rat. So that's a classical diabetic rat model. So all of these different physiological effects were observed due to treatment with these vanadium salts. And so people thought, oh, then vanadium salts play the role of mimicking insulin. All right, so studies were done in order to assess the property of these different compounds. So this is just a perspective of the in vivo evaluation of an anti-diabetic agent. So what you're doing here is creating a model of diabetes. So you're using this compound STZ. It induces diabetes in Wistar rats. Okay, so this is a rat model in which diabetes is induced. And so what exactly is that molecule doing? So you see the molecule to the right, and so essentially what it's doing, it's killing beta cells. Remember, if you impact beta cells detrimentally, that can lead to the onset of a diabetic type condition, and that's essentially what's being done here. So you're killing these cells cannot produce the insulin. So that's become something equivalent to a resistance towards insulin. All right, so the question then became, does vanadium actually mimic insulin? Or are we looking at a situation where we're seeing an enhancement of insulin? So the idea of an insulin mimetic is that you have vanadium basically replacing absent insulin in diabetic rats. And so in a study with a biograding diabetes-prone rats, so BBDP rats, vanadium was observed not to keep the rats alive in total absence of insulin. So these rats had no insulin, they were treated with vanadium salts, and these rats perished as a consequence of this. However, you do the same experiment with this rat model, you dose them with insulin, okay? And what's observed is that you're able to obtain normal glycemia. Do the same experiment, the same rat model, you dose them with some amount of insulin, a lower amount, but also with some amount of vanadium, okay? And what you are able to achieve is normal glycemia. So it appears that what the function of the vanadium is that it's helping to increase the sensitivity towards insulin. At least that's what the data indicated in this particular study. So that what vanadium actually is doing is not mimicking insulin, rather it's actually enhancing the sensitivity towards the insulin. That being said, there are some people, and some actually really important people in the field, that will still refer to the term insulin mimetic. I personally don't use that term. I use the phrase insulin enhancer, but we all have our perspective of how we're looking at this. All right, so let's look at what exactly the vanadium is doing in terms of exhibiting that anti-diabetic property. So here we're looking at this perspective of vanadium solubilized in water, and we're appreciating the pH-dependent aqueous speciation. So this goes all the way back to the beginning of the course when we talked about pH-dependent aqueous speciation. We actually looked at this figure previously, where we looked at how vanadium-4, when we're focusing on micromolar concentrations in water at different pH values, how it speciates, how it distributes. And so a really important feature of this is when we're looking at more of the physiological range, what is occurring with that vanadium. And it turns out that there's a particular species that forms, so this is species right here, this vanadate species, that can mimic phosphates. Okay, and so keep in mind, phosphate is an important molecule in the context of the phosphorylation signal for insulin sensitivity. So the idea is that perhaps the vanadium is forming into a species that mimics the phosphate, and because of that, it's able to interact with PTB1B and interact with this catalytic site cysteine, and because of that interaction, it inhibits the interaction between cysteine and phosphate. And something that's really important is that the phosphate group, it has its abilities to be bioconverted and participate in different chemical reactions, but the vanadate group does not have that feature. So basically, binding vanadate to cysteine could potentially serve as a very effective inhibitor. So people have characterized this idea of vanadium interaction with phosphatases. Remember, phosphatases are a family of protein. PTB1B is one type of enzyme, and that's the one that's believed to be associated with insulin resistance. And so here we have the perspective of a structure that was obtained for the interaction of the vanadate group with the active site cysteine. So here's this zoom in of the vanadate group, so it's vanadium-4 interacting with that cysteine, and it gives us this composition right here, where we have this this binding, this coordination of the vanadium in this context to the sulfur of the cysteine group. And every other site is actually an oxygen that's coming from the vanadium starting group, not from the protein. There's really only one point of contact, one coordination site. So in terms of the dissociation constant, vanadium-4 has a KD of 0.4 to 5 micromolar, okay? Whereas phosphate has a KD of 10 to 30 millimolar, all right? So in this perspective, then, you want the KD value to be lower. So that indicates to you that the binding of vanadium-4 is much stronger than the binding of phosphate, and that indicates that vanadium could be a very effective inhibitor of the phosphatases, but in the perspective of what we're talking about of PTB1B, right? So that became the working principle of how vanadium-4 can operate in this context. Let's also look at vanadium-5. And so we go back to something I showed you at the beginning of the course where we looked at the pH-dependent aqueous speciation of vanadium-5. And so here we're looking at it, and we know, as we've seen previously, it's a very complex speciation. But something that's very important, just like I mentioned with vanadium-4, is that there is a form of it that becomes more pronounced at the higher pH range. So obviously we're going outside of the physiological range, but still something that you can see generated that approximates the phosphate. So here you have vanadium-5, and this is vanadate form, and that is isostructural and also isoelectronic with the phosphate group. And so it's believed that vanadium-5, like vanadium-4, can serve as an inhibitor of the cysteine group, of the cysteine active site within the PTB1B. All right, so people decided to move on from the use of vanadium salts because, as we've discussed in this course, many different metal salts can show certain therapeutic properties, but metal salts have a lot of problems in that they can be poorly soluble, especially when you're talking about hydrolysis-prone metals. They can lead to precipitation and loss of activity. So vanadium, as I discussed earlier in the course as well, vanadium-4 and especially vanadium-5 are extremely hydrolysis-prone. So you would want to not work with vanadium salt because of its likelihood to precipitate and lose activity. And so people started to then design small molecule vanadium complexes with really important chelators that can help to stabilize the vanadium center. So here we have a representation of a very important chelator, the maltol chelator. So we have A, which is the bis-maltolado oxyvanadium-4 complex, and B, another really important molecule, the ethyl version of that chelator, which is the bis-ethyl-maltolado oxyvanadium-4 complex. Both of these complexes demonstrate a very similar coordination environment. The coordination number 5, square parameter structure, we've talked about this briefly before. And both of these follow Lipinski's rule for compounds to be orally active in humans. They possess a molecular weight that is characteristic of something that should be orally deliverable and also has the lipophilic properties that one would desire. And so these compounds were tested and exhibited really important properties like the vanadium salts. For instance, in Chinese hamster ovarian cells or CHO cells, they inhibited overexpressed PTB1B, so that was an important property. In male STZ Wistar rats, so that is a diabetic model, when you dose 0.6 millimole per kilogram orally of these compounds or injected 0.1 millimole per kilogram of the compounds, that resulted in nomoglycemia in these rat models for 2 days. So that dosage was able to maintain a normal amount of glucose in these rats. Another study with a different model, so this is STZ DDY mice. When you inject 0.1 millimole per kilogram of these compounds, it resulted in nomoglycemia within 18 hours. So it shows the effective potency of these compounds. All right, so look at this one with a little bit more data here. So we're looking at these two vanadium complexes. Again, we have the same core structures. And so we're looking at dosing this particular rat model, the STZ Wistar rat, and we're seeing what happens to the plasma glucose. So here, we're looking at the dosage of these compounds. So similar response of dosage of 0.6 millimoles per kilogram of both of these compounds. And so what we're observing is what happens to the blood glucose level, okay, so, or the plasma glucose level. So 20 millimolar, that's significantly above normal amounts of glucose levels. So within rats, what's considered normal is about, at the human level, about 5 millimolar. And what we see over time, after the dosage of these compounds, that you're able to reduce this pretty effectively to about 7.5, and it remains low, at least not as high as before, for a period of 48 hours. Okay, so that's a pretty significant finding there. From the perspective to the right, what we're looking at is the glucose levels in blood and different dosages of these complexes. So we're focusing on one of these, but you get a very similar dose response where the effective concentration as you're applying this basically starts to become normal at the 0.6 millimole per kilogram, which is what we see dosed over here. Okay, so going to 0.8 doesn't significantly decrease the plasma glucose level. So that basically gives you that optimal level of dosage of these compounds. So this particular compound, this version of it, the ethyl version of the maltol ligand, it actually advanced to clinical trials. So there were a number of really important scientists. One of the lead one being Christopher Orvig from Canada. He was really pushing forward the use of vanadium in a clinical context. It advanced to clinical trials, made it to phase 2. So this here we're looking at dosages of 0.03 to 0.26 millimoles per kilograms. And what was observed was that no significant toxicity was observed in humans, but unfortunately, not enough efficacy. And so because of the lack of potency, it was then no longer proceeded to further clinical trials. There's some arguments that they didn't test high enough of a concentration and that they had tested higher concentration given previous studies that suggest higher concentrations could be handled by the human body. But nonetheless, this basically stopped right there, and actually no other vanadium compound has advanced to clinical trials since then. And actually a number of prominent researchers in the field moved on and they no longer work on vanadium in this context. So let's get some insights to what may have been the cause of this disappointing result. So again, aqueous speciation is one to really point towards looking at how does this compound behave within a pH-dependent environment. So if we're thinking about this as a compound that's delivered orally, and we're looking at its then, as it transports to the digestive system and into the bloodstream and then to affect the blood glucose, well, looking at this from this perspective, when we're talking about the digestion, we're talking about low pH value. So it's more in the acidic range. And at a pH of 2, Brenda, okay, since you're here, what can we say about this compound? What percentage of this compound even exists at a pH of 2? So we're looking here. What percentage of the compound exists? Zero, exactly. So Brenda said 0. There's no amount of that compound would exist at pH of 2. There's about, I would say, maybe a little bit above 20% of a version of the compound that contains one of the maltol ligands that would still exist, all right? So you have that issue where at a pH of 2, this compound will dissociate significantly. And so you have already a decrease in the amount of effective compound available. So a 0.6 millimole per kilogram oral dose of this compound, 2 to 3 times greater absorbed amount than the same dose of the vanadium sulfate salt. So the compound was more effective at being absorbed into the body. So you have about 2 to 3 times more absorbance. But even still, you have a significantly low amount that's going to get absorbed into the body, relatively speaking. And so it's observed that this compound and also the other version of it without the ethyl group on the ligand achieve the same therapeutic insulin-enhancing effect at significantly lower dosages than the simple vanadium salts. And people have explored the idea of, well, we know that these compounds dissociate. Well, what about if we encapsulate them? And encapsulation actually has shown to increase their absorption after oral administration. So people have explored this idea of encapsulation as a means to stabilize the compound and to increase absorption. Okay, so we know that the speciation to some extent results in a decreased amount of effective compound that ultimately will reach the cellular environment. But reach the cellular environment, But in its path from the gut into the bloodstream, what is believed to be the fate of the compounds? Well, it appears that there's some amount of biotransformation. We already talked about it in the context of digestion, but there's an association with transferrin that's believed to be critical. So the vanadium that can enter into the bloodstream from these compounds, I'm not being general here, I'm referring to these compounds, is almost entirely bound to human serum transferrin in 2 modalities. One modality is one that's proposed right here, where you have the vanadium that's still coordinated to the ligand, right? So you have that one metal, one ligand affiliation. We know that vanadium tends to be hydrolysis prone, so you still have that oxo ligand associated with the vanadium. So the vanadium basically brings in its own anion, the anion being that oxide. And so that serves, if you want to think of it in terms of the perspective of transferrin, as its own synergistic anion, just like the carbonate is a synergistic anion of iron, it also appears to be, to some extent, a synergistic anion of vanadium. So the points of contact between vanadium to the iron binding site of transferrin are the tyrosines, either one of the two tyrosines, and either aspartate or histidine. So you have the capability of the vanadate with the maltol ligand being able to coordinate to the iron binding site. Let me clean that up so you guys can see that better. To the iron binding site. The affinity is lower than iron itself, but nonetheless, it's sufficiently high for that vanadium to potentially be transported through the transferrin endocytosis process. Another modality is, and so this was a little bit of a, perhaps not a realistic depiction of how this might happen, is the idea that the complex can take advantage of iron-bound human transferrin. So I don't have it there, but let's imagine we have iron-bound human transferrin, but this compound becomes associated with the surface of the protein. So you can imagine an interaction, let's say, with a histidine group. It doesn't necessarily have to be histidine, but this is the perspective of how that interaction may be possible, where you have this interaction between the vanadium sensor and a coordinating amino acid on the surface of the protein. And basically this complex will piggyback onto iron-bound human transferrin, which will induce endocytosis and can bring that compound into the cellular environment and potentially release it into the cytosol. So this is another modality by which vanadium might be able to do this. And I mentioned this early in the course when we talked about serum transferrin being able to introduce non-iron metals into cells. This is another route by which vanadium might be able to do this. The thing about this is that this proposes that we would have both ligands. And so that would only be possible if you do not do this by oral administration, and that perhaps you deliver the compound right into the blood environment, and then that might be able to retain the ligands much more. Because if you go back to the speciation, let's go ahead and do that. Go back to the speciation. If you look at the speciation here, if you notice that compound is much more stable at the physiological patron. So, delivery intravenously would be much more effective in terms of preserving the compound. Okay. Let's start there. All right, so we were here. All right, so then, this is a perspective of what would be the biological fate of the vanadium from these compounds. If you go through an oral delivery, okay, you're going to enter into the gastrointestinal tract, and that's going to lead to a significant amount of the vanadium just dissociating and actually being excreted through the feces. You're going to have a small amount of compound, and not even the original compound. So this is a little bit of not necessarily the most accurate depictions, but you have a small amount of the compound, vanadium chelated to the maltol ligand, that then can enter into the bloodstream, to the circulatory system. That a significant amount of that would then become associated with transferrin, whether ligand bound to the iron binding site or to the surface. And then you have the distribution of that vanadium. You also have the perspective of entering through an intravenous, which is directly into the bloodstream, or intraperitoneally, which is through the gut, through the stomach, and then that enters to the absorbed into the bloodstream. And so how that can lead to a distribution of the vanadium itself. But now let's look at this from the perspective of the impact of vanadium as far as inhibition of P2B phosphatases. So here, the idea is that you have your compound that enters into the bloodstream, and then it becomes associated with transferrin. Whether or not the ligand is bound, okay, so here that's a little bit of a question mark, whether the ligand is still associated with the protein. It enters into the intracellular environment, and there the vanadium is capable of binding to the cysteine of P2B1B. As a consequence of that, it prevents cleavage of the phosphate groups. And so what happens then is that you preserve this phosphorylation cascade, and that allows for the glucose transporter 4 to translocate to the plasma membrane and bring in the glucose and maintaining that normal glycemia. So that's the working mechanism of how these vanadium compounds appear to operate. All right. But the interesting thing is that in vivo speciation may not always work exactly as some of these models do. And that's the beauty of having some sophisticated techniques to be able to study what happens within the bloodstream. So here was a study I showed you a long time ago where we looked at taking different vanadium-4 complexes with different ligands. One of those ligands was this piconolate ligand. Okay. All these compounds exhibit an anti-diabetes type 2 property. So from this study, taking these compounds, putting them in solution and maybe blood with transferrin, albumin, and different anions that are present in blood, it was observed that this particular compound would speciate, and it would be largely vanadium transferrin without any ligand bound to it, and a small amount of compound that has that is small molecule, and of those two compounds, one of them containing at least one of the piconolate ligand bound to the vanadium. So we're talking about basically about 70% of the compound dissociating and the vanadium binding to transferrin. So that's what this data indicates. But a study was done with an animal model using APR, in which basically the blood was monitored after this particular compound, this vanadium piconolate complex, was injected into the rodent. And so essentially what they were looking at is the vanadium signal, because again, APR is sensitive towards paramagnetic metals, and so it will be sensitive towards the vanadium-4 that's present there. And what they observed was vanadium signals. So they looked at this over time. Okay. And this APR signal that was observed was indicative of a small molecule vanadium complex, but not vanadium bound to transferrin. So that was actually really important as they were assessing what is actually the fate of that vanadium. So following administration, that vanadium piconolate species was found to be present in bone and organs. So actually they found vanadium still coordinated to the piconolate distributed through the body of the rodent, although it's not exactly clear how they were localized there. So maybe transfer may have participated in it, but it's not clear, at least from the EPR perspective, that was necessarily the case. Also, those vanadium-4 species, when they clear from the blood, believed to redistribute into the tissues before they get eliminated in the urine. So there's some amount of longevity of those vanadium species within the rodent, which may have exhibited some of the anti-diabetic properties. But here they were mostly focusing on the fate of the compound that they were observing. Okay, so one final thing that I want to talk about with respect to vanadium is the possible toxicity associated with vanadium-4. So keep in mind that vanadium-5 has no d electrons, that is diamagnetic. Vanadium-4, however, has one d electron. And as I discussed to you previously, within the cellular environment, it's reducing, and vanadium-4 is likely to exist much more dominantly than vanadium-5. Vanadium-4 has the capacity to redox cycle. And what I mean by redox cycle is to go vanadium-4, vanadium-5. And because of that ability to flux between those two oxidation states, it can lead to the production of ROS. And so that's something that could lead to toxicity. And so mitochondria can generate ROS induced by this vanadyl unit, vanadium oxide 2+, and possibly reduce the vanadium-4 in this unit to vanadium-3. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how people have tried to deal with this vanadium-4 associated toxicity. So what they wanted to work with was with flavonoids. So these are molecules, so here's just a representation of flavonoids, where essentially their function is to prevent injury caused by free radicals by serving as a scavenger of reactive oxygen species. And so here we have the perspective of a flavonoid. So here we have the functionality that we know as catechol, and how that can participate in the scavenging of reactive oxygen species by basically donating a proton. So we essentially see how the catechol can be converted to the quinone and how it can effectively serve as a scavenger of these particular species. And so here we can appreciate the redox potentials of different flavonoids and how that can fall in line with the capability of reducing free radicals or these reactive oxygen species in this context. So they wanted to, in these set of studies, look at the potential of these type of flavonoids for their metal binding properties, because they do have these functionalities where you could have metal binding, such as at the catechol site, or even in these are sites that can afford metal coordination or metal chelation in this context. And so the idea is that these flavonoids have this capability because they can interact with redox active metals within cells, such as iron and copper, which have this capacity of Fenton type chemistry, which we've talked about before. And so this metal binding capability is well known, and possibly was what participates in their ability to control this redox. And so a number of studies were done to create vanadium flavonoid complexes and to observe their potential anti-diabetic properties, but also their ability to reduce any ROS generation. So here we have a depiction of coordination to vanadium-4 with this 3-hydroxyflavone, and it's forming the square pyramidal type structure. So here's just an assessment of the point group of this molecule that's due to the geometry of this compound. I'm not going to go into too much details here, especially if someone hasn't taken inorganic chemistry. This might be a little bit difficult to follow. But what we're looking at here is the d orbital distribution in terms of energy, because these d orbitals are not going to be degenerate in this coordination environment. And we're looking at essentially the excitation of one electron, because this is a D1 electron configuration, and the different electronic transitions. And that is depicted here in terms of the UV-Vis spectroscopy of this compound, where we have 4 key transitions that are associated with this excitation of that single electron from the ground state to the excited state D orbital. So we're looking at DD transitions here. Okay. So in terms of the speciation, so this particular compound, similar to what we have seen with other vanadium-4 complexes, low pH, we have a significant dissociation, but at high pH, we have intact compounds. Okay, so that's important in terms of the perspective of these type of molecules serving as chelators for vanadium, that we're not really changing too much about the stability at low pH, but we're still maintaining stability at the physiologically range of blood, relevant range of blood. All right, so let's look at the properties of these compounds in terms of their anti-diabetes functionality. And so here we're looking at testing of a dosage of this compound, 0.01 millimoles per kilogram. We're looking at the complex itself and also at the free ligand, same dosage. And what we see is that there is a synergism of the vanadium with the ligand in terms of reducing the blood glucose. So we have for the vanadium compound, a 57.7 reduction in blood glucose. And for the ligand, we have around 11% reduction. So clearly, the combination of vanadium and the ligand is important for reducing that blood glucose. And so this data that we have seen here is a depiction of the formation of liver glycogen. So again, glycogen is the polymeric form of the glucose, is the storage of glucose. And we're looking at what's happening when you compare control to a diabetic model, where in the diabetic model, we have a significantly lower amount of liver glycogen that's being produced. We're looking at the effects of the compound on the control, where basically there's not any real significant effect. But then we're looking at the effect of the compound, the vanadium compound or the free ligand with the diabetic model. And we can see that the vanadium compound is able to rescue that property of liver glycogen formation. But for just the free ligand, we don't see too much of a difference between the diabetic model and the diabetic model with the ligand itself. So clearly, it's the vanadium compound that's important here in terms of the property of glucose reduction and also glycogen formation. All right. And so here we're looking at the levels of fasting blood glucose in control and experimental groups of rats, 30 days experiment period. And essentially, we're looking again at what's happening with the blood glucose comparing to control. Okay, so control, we have this amount of glucose in the blood of this animal that is fasted means that has not been fed, and we see that the levels of the glucose is not significantly different, but for the diabetic control, the presence of the vanadium compound or even the ligand is able to reduce the amount of glucose much more the vanadium complex at that particular dosage. Okay, so we see the significance of how this compound is impacting the diabetic model. All right, so here we have another compound still in line with these flavonoid complexes. So this is the depiction of the structure of that compound, the BQOV. So delivered or administered orally at a one-time dose of 0.4 millimole per kilogram to diabetic mice. The blood glucose is measured at 21 hours after dosing. So we're looking at the reduction in the blood glucose level. Okay, so this is the equation of how that percent reduction was measured. And so we're looking at the this compound, okay, the one that's shown over here, versus the free ligand, okay, versus the vanadyl sulfate salt, and versus the maltolado salt, not salt, compound. And so you see that this particular compound was the most effective at reducing the blood glucose level relative to the free ligand, but also relative to the two vanadium sources, the vanadium salt, but also that maltolado compound that did that was part of the clinical trials or the alpha version of it. So that shows that this compound does have more promising activity on that level. Another very significant finding, because remember, thinking back to the whole point of why these type of ligands were being tested, was to assess the effect on ROS generation. So here we have an experiment that was done. This is a DCFHDA staining. Essentially, you're looking at the relative formation of ROS species. And what we're looking at here is the formation of ROS as depicted by the presence of the vanadyl sulfate salt versus this compound BQOV. And what we see is that the BQOV compound over time, and also in terms of dosage, can lead to much less ROS formation than the vanadium salt. And so that shows that we also have the added bonus of these compounds being able to reduce the amount of ROS formation. ROS formation might lead to toxicity, and that's one of the things that was being assessed to try to avoid toxicity that's associated with vanadium. Okay. All right, so to summarize then all this information, and this is more related to vanadium-4 than it is to vanadium-5, just to make that disclaimer here. So what are the requirements for anti-diabetic vanadium-4 compound, at least what's proposed? So the ligands must enhance the bioavailability of vanadium-4. That's going to be very important, especially when we're talking about this vanadium, this vanadyl unit. The ligands must bind the metal with sufficient affinity at acidic pH, if you're thinking about an oral delivery, to prevent complete dissociation prior to absorption. Based on the proposed mechanism, the ligand and the vanadium form must associate for the compound to become pharmaceutically active. Therefore, the use of non-toxic ligands is a priority. So that's the proposed mechanism of the vanadium becoming associated with transferrin in order for it to be released into the cellular environment. And where possible, the ligand should regulate the redox activity of the metal. All right. So as I already mentioned to you, currently there are no other vanadium compounds that are advancing to the clinical trials, and there's much less researchers that are really looking at vanadium in terms of its anti-diabetic properties. But although I don't have it here, still one of the leaders in the field, Debbie Kranz at Colorado State University, she has recently shown that she can modify one of the vanadium compounds to try to selectively target PTB1B. So she's still working in that spectrum of trying to make vanadium compounds that are much more selective. All right. Any questions before we head out? Any questions, any doubts? Sí.
Hay una evidencia que las personas que son hipoglicémicas. ¿Existe algún compuesto así que pueda ayudar a esas personas que no sea solamente una persona que hipoglicémica tiene que comer los otras horas, entonces hay una variedad de
See, so it depends. So like there are a number of hormones that people have produced. So there are a number of peptides, and so this is more like closer to like some stuff that Punchi has been studying. some peptides that are really critical to regulating the control of how much glucose is in the body. So this could be at the level of looking, I have to look at it a little more closely, because I did study some of this at the postdoc. Certain key peptides that people have tried to not necessarily develop the peptide, but try to understand how to regulate them so that you have more effective amounts in your body. So there are like inhibitors of pathways that can allow for these hormones to still be effective and control the level of sugar in your body. So yeah, but I don't, at this moment, I don't recall specifically which one, but that's something to, we can look up. Other questions? All right, everyone, so I'll see you later.